Hey y'all, welcome to the second sidebar of season 2. We are rolling right through this thing. If you're listening to this in real time, I'm sorry, I was eating a Milky Way. This is a commercial reference, but anyway, I was on a bit of a hiatus. The last episode aired like 2 weeks ago, but I'm back. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but these sidebars are very strategically broken into segments. Because that's the genius of how my mind works. Anywho, no, really though, even going back to the very beginning, season 1, the first sidebar covered Shelonda's early years of feeling ugly and experiencing body shame. The second was the chunk of time when Ron was grooming her. The third encompassed the building of the relationship between Shelonda and Ken, up to the point where he got arrested for attacking Ron, and so forth and so on. This season is structured in the exact same way. And yes, I'm saying all of this to make a point. I'm sure you're all familiar with the order of operations, so I'm going to touch base on where we left off. Our last sidebar covered episodes 1 through 6. And at the conclusion of episode 6, I'm not going anywhere, Shelonda decided just that. That was the beginning of her falling for Antonio. And after he did that thing, Shelonda's consideration for the other women pretty much went out of the window. That was very strategic placement as it relates to the sidebar. The end of that episode closed a portal of sorts. It was an ending and a beginning. At the very beginning of this season, we were tasked with the question, how did that happen? How did Shelonda become involved with Antonio? Episodes 1 through 6 make that very clear. She got involved with him through the happenstance of him being available in her time of need. And then he exposed her to some other things that she liked. With that question answered, here we are at sidebar number 2. And we are presented with another question. Why? In the beginning of this season, Shelonda mentions that he becomes her new kin. So he had to have been super impactful to her. So why is that? Let's answer that question. Episode 7, Clownfish and Anemone. I mentioned at the end of the last sidebar that this was one of my favorite episodes. And you may wonder why. Well, let's discuss it. Shelonda starts to spend a lot of time at the club. And in doing so, she realizes that Antonio has a value system. He treats everyone and everything according to where they fall within his system. He doesn't care what Cream and Peaches do, who they sleep with, etc. But he makes it obvious that Shelonda is off limits because she falls within a different place in the value system. This becomes evident on some random occasion when she's at the club. Shelonda is in the dressing room when Cream offers her drugs. Of course, for the purpose of theatrics and histrionics, Antonio walks in just in time to see this offer take place. He chokes Cream, drags Shelonda to his office, and basically starts screaming on her. Shelonda flashes back to the abuse that she once suffered with Ken, and she's terrified. Antonio calms her down and offers an explanation about why he's so bothered. But because he's Antonio and he has a fascination with nature shows, he does so in a way that I personally think is absolute genius. And I think it is because I wrote it that way. The reason why I love this so much is because you get even more insight into the relationship between these two characters. Antonio tells Shelonda that Peaches and Cream are shrimp. They're means to an end people who do whatever it takes to survive. He also compares their relationship to that of a clownfish and a sea anemone. In his version of this mutually beneficial relationship, the anemone provides, protects, and feeds the clownfish. The only catch is the clownfish has to stay close because the anemone is anchored to the seafloor. And let's not forget that little tidbit about the clownfish being loyal and monogamous. And here's where we really start to see some growth in Shelonda, because she calls him on it. She's like, yeah, the anemone provides, protects, and feeds the clownfish, but only because that's the nature of what it is. It's there, anchored on the seafloor. The clownfish is being fed, but if it didn't eat the fungus off of the anemone, it will likely die. The clownfish has to develop its own mucus lining that makes it immune to the anemone, and if it were ever washed away, the anemone would eat it. Shelonda surmises that she would be disposed of if she didn't know how to cook the books, the equivalent of the sea anemone eating the clownfish if the mucus lining were ever washed away. Antonio is deeply saddened by this. For the first time, he tells Shelonda that he loves her, and he wants a chance to prove to her where she stands. She agrees, of course, and folds like a pretzel. They go to her house and have amazing sex, because that's obviously the formula for success for them. And also, she agrees to be his clownfish, loyal and monogamous. Episode 8, Taking Over. So now, Shelonda is madly in love with Antonio. Peaches is still at the bottom of the hierarchy, and Shelonda has taken over Cream Spot. That's all good and fine until she starts to notice the disparity between her and Sharon. She notices that Antonio is doing things for her, but he's actually investing in Sharon. The straw that broke the camel's back was Antonio taking Sharon to Jamaica. It is absolutely insane that this girl resented Sharon in that moment. Shelonda took over Sharon's clients, which was an opportunity for her to make money, but she somehow flipped it into her keeping Sharon's business afloat while she was out of town gallivanting with her man. So while she had initially been perfectly fine with staying in her place, Shelonda decided that Sharon had to come down in the hierarchy. Thus, she started racing her for Antonio when they got back from Jamaica. But the kicker is, Sharon couldn't win because she was completely unaware that they were racing. And throughout this race, Antonio was spoon-feeding Shelonda the formula for success by telling her where Sharon fell short. Shelonda mentions that there was no chicanery involved. I like that word, chicanery. It basically means trickery or deception. Flim-flam. Anyway, there was none of that. Shelonda literally just did whatever Sharon didn't do. If Sharon didn't cook, she cooked whatever Antonio wanted. If Sharon was too tired for sex, Shelonda wasn't, even when she was. And in the end, she knew that she had won the race when Antonio bought her a luxury car and asked her to go to Hawaii. Episode 9, Unmet Obligations Part 1. Looking at Shelonda's patterns of behavior, you have to realize something about her. If she's in a relationship, it's probably going to completely dominate her life. In dealing with Antonio, it was guaranteed that she would have time for very few other things. She started going to the gas station late or failing to show up at all. She failed to meet the submission deadline for college, which meant that she didn't transfer to a 4-year university, even though she had a 4.2 grade point average. And as a result of her inability to be reliable, Sharon told her that she no longer needed her at the salon. Shelonda knew that was a direct result of her inability to be dependable, and she was bothered that she had let Sharon down again. The first time was when she had quit the salon because of Ken. Weirdly enough, Shelonda was able to look this lady in the face while sleeping with her boyfriend. But even she understood how messed up it was that Sharon had consistently provided an opportunity that she squandered away at her will, and she did feel bad about that. However, she didn't really feel that bad. She looked at it as an opportunity to do what she really wanted to do, which was spend time with Antonio. And that provides a segue to what happens next. Since Shelonda is no longer working at the salon, she realizes that she has to start doing Cassidy's hair at home. She calls to tell Ron that he has to bring Cassidy to the house opposed to the salon. Surprisingly, Mom answers the phone, which hadn't happened since they fell off over the insurance money. And what happens next opens a huge box. Ron is in jail. Yes, jail. Shelonda doesn't care about all that. As far as she's concerned, he could stay there. And Mom can bring Cassidy to get her hair done. But then Mom issues a random apology, and Shelonda knows that something deeper is in play. since apologies weren't ever really Mom's thing. Mom apologizes for letting Shelonda down and not seeing Ron for who he was. And she admits to being forced to see that truth as a result of something heartbreaking. Ron touched Cassidy. But even more heartbreaking were the details surrounding the discovery. Mom didn't just hear news of Ron abusing Cassidy. She came home from work and caught him forcibly raping her. Shelonda was livid, and I was too. This is a little girl. Shelonda was 14 when Ron started touching her, or was it 12? I don't know. But she was 16 by the time he got around to raping her. While rape is traumatic in any situation, I imagine that it would have been even more so for someone like Cassidy. First and foremost, she was like 10, I think. The average 10-year-old has a very limited understanding of anything sexual, certainly not in the way of experience. But Cassidy wasn't the average 10-year-old. She was already at a mental disadvantage, and being violated by a trusted party would certainly have been confusing and scary for her. And it was a whole different low for Ron because Shelonda and Sharon were bad enough, but his transgression against Cassidy showed that there were no boundaries for this guy. There were no familial boundaries, and there were no age boundaries. He was just an equal opportunity predator. And because she left without her, Shelonda felt that she had failed Cassidy, which leads directly into episode 10, Unmet Obligations Part 2. Shelonda was emotionally destroyed by what happened to Cassidy, and as a result, a part of her felt reconnected to Mom. After all, they were on the same side of that thing. But just as Shelonda was about to extend some grace, Mom did what Mom does. She asked Shelonda to take Cassidy for a while. Her rationale? Well, initially she says that she's under a lot of pressure and she doesn't want to fall back into the grass of drugs. To layer it, she says that she can't financially support Cassidy with Ron being in jail. Shelonda is incensed. If you're keeping up, you realize that Ron hadn't ever been much of a provider, a fact that was not lost upon Shelonda. She realizes that Mom is trying to pawn Cassidy off for her own selfish reasons, and that infuriates her. And why wouldn't it? So Shelonda goes on a rant, telling Mom everything that she's wanted to tell her for years. She tells her how hard it really was to live with the understanding that Ron's love was more important than her being there to protect her. So she says no. She tells Mom that she's not going to take Cassidy to make her life easier. So Mom drops a bomb, and ultimately an ultimatum. Mom tells Shelonda that she was impregnated by a family friend and nobody believed her. She wanted to have an abortion, but only relented after Grandma said she'd take custody, a promise that wasn't kept. Consequently, she'd always felt some kind of way about Grandma and Shelonda because she felt that she was made to be a mother against her will, and Shelonda was a walking reminder of the trauma that she faced. And if it wasn't hurtful enough, she tells Shelonda that she wanted to leave her when she moved in with Ron, but he insisted that they bring her along. I find it absolutely inconceivable that she tells Shelonda that she ruined all of that for her, as if getting raped by Ron was her decision. And then she admits the truth about Cassidy. She doesn't want to be a mother because she's experiencing the same feelings that she had with Shelonda now that the relationship with Ron has been tainted. She's a part of him, and Mom hates that. And she's not going to stand around and own up to her responsibilities. She tells Shelonda that if she doesn't take Cassidy, she'll put her in a home and deny all access to her. Shelonda tells Cassidy that she loves her, then tells Mom she has to do what she has to do. Sidebar. I've had a couple of conversations with people about Shelonda's decision not to take Cassidy. They can go either way, but the general consensus is that she should have taken her. For the record, I think she should have taken her too. Under those circumstances, I absolutely think I would have. But looking at it from Shelonda's perspective, I have to see something that wasn't stated. Yes, Shelonda was trying to keep up with Antoni in the hierarchy, and she didn't have time for Cassidy. But there really is something else in play too. Think about it. Shelonda was like 20 years old, I think. Honestly, my math be all over the place because I think Cassidy should have been 8. Thinking back, I believe Shelonda was 12 when Cassidy was born. Anyway, you realize that Shelonda is barely out of her teens. She spent most of her childhood being a full-time caretaker to Cassidy, Mom, and Ron, and not in the superficial way that most teens are. She wasn't just babysitting. Shelonda was cooking, cleaning, washing, potty training, etc. And when things were at their worst, it was pure tyranny. After Ron found out about Ken, he had her hanging his clothes outside in freezing temperatures. And after that, it was Ken. She moved in with him and lived a life that was far too advanced for a girl of her age. She cooked, cleaned, and got abused when things didn't go well, all while having to get up and go to school. The life that she had with Antonio was her first taste of feeling free. For the first time, she could come and go at her leisure. There was nothing holding her back. And for as messed up as it sounds to equate Cassidy to a thing that would have held her back, I'm sure a lot of people in her situation would feel threatened by the potential erasure of that new life. Basically, it would be really hard to go back to being that full-time caretaker after having that little taste of freedom. But anyway, that was the decision that she made. And it leads to episode 11. I love that. Okay, another sidebar. In writing the story, chapter 11 was a bit of an add-in. And if you think about it, it probably could have been excluded. It wouldn't have made a difference in the storyline. The I love that chapter was added in after the fact, when I was in the editing and revision process. That chapter was added in for 3 reasons. 1, the unmet expectations 1 and 2 chapters were super heavy, subject matter-wise. I felt that the readers needed something to get away from the heaviness of what that whole Ron situation was. Kind of like a palate cleanser. So that chapter was kind of a way of resetting the tone. Like, yeah, this really awful thing happened, and Shelonda was suffering some mental damage over it, but here's something a little bit lighter. Had that chapter not existed, it kind of would have gone from one problematic thing to another. The second reason why that chapter was added was to do the thing that was presented at the start of the sidebar. Answer the why. The I Love That episode gives some insight into why Shelonda was so in love with Antonio. And to do that, Shelonda presents it herself. To quote, she says, "You may be wondering why I was so in love with Antonio, especially because of the baggage that came along with him. Sure, he bought me things, but anyone could have bought me things. He took me places, but anyone could have taken me places. We had great sex. I could have gotten that from numerous places as well. I could have gotten all of those things from someone else, but it wouldn't have been the same. No one could have been what Antonio was at that time. He had the ability to make anyone feel as if they were the only person in the world. I love that." End quote. And to prove the point, Shelonda goes on to give examples of why Antonio had such an impression on her. Sidebar. Now, this can't be noted in the podcast because obviously you can't see it. But something very important happens in the book version. Initially, Antonio's name is spelled out in a completely normal way. Antonio. But as Shelonda's feelings towards him change, the last O in his name changes as well in the book. Once Shelonda falls in love with him, the last O in his name becomes this kind of heart with an exclamation point at the end. I entered it that way on the episode title for reference. I hope it actually shows up so y'all can see it. But basically, she's in love with Antonio, and that's reflected by the way his name is presented in the book. Just a fun fact, but anyway. Shelonda gives examples of why she loves Antonio so much, and it starts off very basic. Feelings and attention. She states that Antonio would bring food to the salon, where both she and Sharon worked. And while he wasn't openly kissing her or holding her hand, he took the time to eat with her. He looked into her eyes as they conversed. He never made her feel as though she came second to Sharon, even though she was very much aware that Antonio still loved Sharon. And at a certain point, Antonio refused to entertain Peaches and Cream when Shelonda was around. He wouldn't let them come into the office if she was there, and he was blatantly disrespectful to them if they tried to speak while Shelonda was speaking. That bothered Shelonda, but she ultimately came back to an unwritten hierarchical rule. Their lives moved a certain way because everyone stayed in place. She accepted Antonio's way of keeping everyone in their places. And that really boiled down to one thing. She needed to feel that way. Shelonda wouldn't ever have been okay with everyone being in their place if her place wasn't at the top. Because when she wasn't at the top, she did whatever she needed to do to get there. And Antonio catered to that. Rounding out the reasons why was Antonio's attention to detail. Shelonda fell in love with the fact that Antonio paid attention to everything, and he made sure that her specifications were met. He bought the car that she wanted, and he made sure that it was presented exactly the way that she wanted it. He took care of that car in the same way that he took care of her. He didn't pay for other people to do it. He did it himself because he felt that it was too important to entrust to anyone else. It should also be noted that he also states that he won't allow anyone else to sleep with Shelonda for that same reason. He doesn't think that anyone can please her in the way that he does. Not because he just doesn't want her to sleep with anyone else, but yeah, okay. Anyway, Antonio is attentive in experiences in the same way that he's attentive with things. Shelonda gives a detailed account of the days leading up to their trip to Hawaii. I won't go through each thing because it's redundant, but it is important, and you'll find out why later. But for that point in time, she recounts how he did everything with his specific measure of detailing, from getting her hair and nails done, with the random lessons about why less is sometimes more, to shopping, to finally the amazing trip to Hawaii, where he planned and executed everything to perfection. This all boils down to Antonio feeding a need that Shelonda had, which was always her story. But specifically with Antonio, he took the time to do something that no one had done to that point. He made her feel seen. He didn't just see her, but he acknowledged her wants, needs, and desires. He paid attention to what she liked, and he capitalized on those things. That had to have been extremely impactful for someone who had basically been overshadowed, overlooked, and suppressed. She was always told what to do, and she was the person that took care of everyone else. For the first time, someone expressed a desire to be that person for her. And when they came back from Hawaii, Antonio didn't take time away from her to play makeup. He made it obvious that he chose to be with her. She knew he had a million other places to be, but he chose to always be with her, and she fell in love with that. Episode 12, he messed up. Shelonda comes home and is hit with the bad news that Antonio has failed his drug test and will likely be going to jail. Sidebar. Originally, this chapter would have followed the unmet obligations chapters. But let's go back to something that I said before. I mentioned that the I Love That chapter was added for 3 reasons. The first was the palate cleanser, because the unmet expectations 1 and 2 were so heavy. And I didn't want to bring another heavy thing right in after that. 2, I wanted to explain why Shelonda loved Antonio so much. And the third thing comes into play here. Without the addition of the I Love That chapter, I think it would have been difficult to understand the level of love that Shelonda had for Antonio. And without that level of love, one would never understand why, on God's green earth, this girl let him talk into running a drug operation. That was certainly not her level of expertise, but she agreed to do it. And not only did she agree, but this girl really put herself on the line. She's like, baby, we in this together. You hear me? You ain't doing this time by yourself, and I'm going to handle this thing. And Antonio feeds into her needs by telling her that she's the only person he can trust. That's something that makes her feel solidified in her position. And she's not going to let any of the other women be that for him. So she agrees. And they have amazing sex because that's what they do. And we move on to episode 13, Learning the Ropes. Antonio signs everything over to Shelonda and makes her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. And that's when it gets real for her. Shelonda starts to feel like it may be a larger undertaking than what she had assumed, and she's concerned that Antonio will get killed as a result of her inability to handle the situation properly. But she's locked in, so she has to learn how to handle his affairs. Shelonda learns that Antonio has a slew of businesses that pretty much ran the same way the strip club did. There was always a cute girl that handled things at the business, and Shelonda wonders if Antonio is sleeping with them. She decides that she'll fire them all once Antonio is arrested. Shelonda realizes that Antonio is into a lot more than she knew. She pays attention and thinks of multiple ways to improve the business operations once Antonio isn't there to stop her. At some point, her nerves get the better of her, and she asks Antonio to just pause the drug business while he's locked up. He laughs and tells her that it's not a movie, like you can't just pause it. Antonio tells her that he has people above and below him, and that people get killed when things don't get done, which makes her even more nervous. To drive home the point, Shelonda breaks it down a little bit. She acknowledges that people would wonder what made her agree to such a large undertaking. And by her standards at the time, Antonio supplied her wants, needs, and desires. Also, she spent every dime that he gave to her. So, he made the introductions, and Shelonda started preparing for the next phase of her life. So, that's it for this sidebar. The next episode is titled Handling Business. And when I tell you that Shelonda started handling business, I'm telling you, she started doing just that. All right. So, we'll let some more build up, and then we'll talk about it on the next sidebar with Chinney. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Chinney Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.